Good morning, DE Bio. Welcome to week 4. Here we are, guys. Monday, April 6th. I just wanted to get us started in a little bit of Bob Marley groove as we kind of work our way through the rest of what we need to cover for evolution. I want to give you a little bit of an overview of the week. Our overview of the week is looking like I have some chapter 24 work that you guys actually did some research on already with your flip grids. I'm going to give you a quick lecture here on that. And then you'll do some follow-up work for chapter 24, and then we'll be done. There's just a few concepts from there that I want you guys to know. On Wednesday, I'm going to give us some final concepts to cover for chapters 25 and 26. It'll be quick, kind of some piecemeal that I'm going to pull from each of those chapters. And we're going to wrap it up. And that'll mean that a week from today, so that'll be next Monday, April 13th, you guys will be taking your final evolution quiz of sorts. There will not be a unit test per se. It's been broken into 3 smaller quizzes in the range of 30 to 35 points each, which adds up basically to 100 points. A little tougher for me just to jump right in fully and give you guys a big unit test online wise. That's why I'm kind of just grouping it into these smaller pieces or sections of evolution. As I say here, as I'm looking at your agenda, that'll get posted on Schoology. We have this week next, and then the week after that is spring break, the week of April 20th. And I know spring break is going to look a lot different than any of us planned, but it's still, to the same point, it is going to be a break from some schoolwork. I don't plan on assigning much of anything, maybe a little just to keep your brains intact a little bit, as I'll probably be doing some things too, just to keep my brain going. But I may also assign something fun, whether it's your choice of a binge watch of something, a book read, or some of you actually trying to teach yourselves some skills, playing instruments or woodworking, things like that. I love to hear about those. So I may give some side assignment of that sort. We'll talk more next week. Guys, continue to stay the course. Continue to find that routine that works best for you, that keeps you motivated and productive, but also gives you proper rest time for yourself and time with your family. All right, without further ado, let's hop into our PowerPoint here. So we're looking at chapter 24, which you guys already looked at already with reproductive isolation, the biological definition of species, and finally allopatric and sympatric speciation. We'll talk a little bit about that. So let's do this. Chapter 24 is titled The Origin of Species, and it really comes down to that conversation or that understanding of when we talk about all these different species and all the diversity and variety that there is of life here on planet Earth. We have to come to some agreements on what actually constitutes a species, what makes one its own separate species from something else. And on a grand scale, that's probably pretty easy because you're like, well, it makes sense, Dupree. A tiger is definitely a different species from a housefly or a human. We can see that. That's real quick and easy. It's not so quick, black and white, when we're actually out in nature and we see a lot of subspecies to species and a lot of crossover. And so that's what we want to talk about here is some ways some tools that we can gain and some definitions that we can understand to see how we start to differentiate one species from another and how they start to actually diverge and become those different species. I don't know about you guys, but I've always been a big Far Side fan. At least growing up, I had a couple Far Side books laying around usually. And the writer, Gary Larson, always had he had a lot of scientific connections. He had such a deep interest in paleontology and evolution and life. And so he's always got handfuls of comics like this throughout his archives. What we want to look at first is that first species concept, the biological species concept that I had you guys define in your own words, which really is, just as it says, those are populations that have members that have the ability to interbreed, produce viable, and more importantly, fertile offspring. If all 3 of those characteristics are met, we're talking about a species. And if they can't interbreed with some closely related species to produce viable and fertile offspring, then those species are separate. So we're looking at the species Panthera tigris right here. I will state quickly, I've not watched the Netflix series that's all the rage these days. Tiger King, maybe it's called. And I probably won't, but I got a feeling some of you guys have seen that one. Moving forward, again, talking about how can it come down to, if we're going to fulfill this understanding of the biological species concept, what separates one species from another? Well, there's a variety of factors that can keep species from doing just that, which is interbreeding to produce viable, fertile offspring. We have two types of barriers. The pre-zygotic barriers, those are barriers that don't even allow male and female to come together to mate and reproduce and produce that zygote. So a pre-zygotic barrier just means that mating or fertilization is completely blocked. And so we'll look at those 5 different types here in a moment. And then the post-zygotic barriers, that's where two individuals, male and female, can come together to mate and they can fertilize, but it's after the zygote is formed, something goes wrong and doesn't allow for that hybrid species to continue. Okay. So if we look at our pre-zygotic barriers, some of you guys researched some of these. There's 5 pre-zygotic barriers that you'll see in your book, and they're listed right here. Just simple graphics that should allow us to connect to each of these and have a memory for each and understand each and be able to recognize examples of each. So if we look at habitat isolation, we could have two populations of similar species or same species even that live in different habitats. Maybe one lives in these trees and the other lives down here in this grassland. Just by that habitat separation, those two species may start to diverge and become their own different species. Temporal, just the word temporal, we can connect to the word time or timing, in that two closely related species may not even mate or breed at the same time of day or the same seasons or same years. And so they just have different ticking of their reproductive clocks. Behavioral isolation, as the simple one is the mating call of birds. Mechanical isolation is where the parts just don't match. When we talk about the reproductive genitalia of males and females. And then finally, gametic isolation just means that the sperm cell and the egg cell just don't recognize each other, almost like two ships passing in the night where there is no real connection. So those are pre-zygotic barriers, and I have a little bit more for each of them here. Habitat isolation, 2 separate species that just don't come into contact with each other. Even though they live in the same area, they may live in different habitats. So going back to this picture here of the trees and the grassland, these could be right next to each other. They're in the same area, but they're just not the same habitat. Let's see. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. As we go down to temporal, again, it's 2 species that breed at different times of day, seasons, or years. And so as we see here, one plant is ready for pollination, ready to reproduce. It's got all of its reproductive stuff ready to go. And this closely related species right next to it, it's actually not reproductively ready during that season. It may be more of a late spring reproducer versus an early spring reproducer here on the left. Behavioral isolation, again, I mentioned earlier, courtship and mating rituals. Unique to each species. These are done to identify potential mates of the same species. And so simply enough, we don't all love country music, I guess. And so that's our difference here for this mating call of these birds. And as we can see, the far side connects here in just different mating songs of different organisms, different species. That poor guy on the bottom right, I assume, was not successful in his efforts. Yeah. Okay, mechanical isolation. Like I mentioned before, that's where the reproductive hardware just doesn't match up male to female. The example in the book is a great one, where shells of 2 species of snail, they look incredibly similar. But just the spiraling of the shell leads to the genitals of the male and the female being misaligned, and they can't actually match up and reproduce. And so that's mechanical isolation. Gametic isolation, again, the sperm of one species is unable to fertilize the egg of another species. Yes, right. The extinction of the dinosaurs not due to climate change, asteroids, etc., just due to emphysema and lung cancer. Please be careful out there, folks. Post-zygotic barriers. Again, these are barriers that separate species after a zygote is formed. So it's not a pre-zygotic, it's a post-zygotic barrier. they're all reduced hybrid something. And they go in order from reduced hybrid viability to reduced hybrid fertility, and then finally, reduced hybrid breakdowns. Let's take a quick look at each. Reduced hybrid viability just means that we can have two separate or two closely related species. They can actually meet up. They clear all the pre-zygotic barriers. They can meet up. Sperm can meet egg cell, and a zygote is produced, and it actually goes through tons of mitosis to produce that offspring. The problem is the offspring is frail, and it actually generally doesn't even survive developmentally to reproductive maturity. And so the example given in the book is of the subspecies of Ensatina, which is a species of salamander. Some of the subspecies, they're super closely related and they can hybridize and produce offspring, but the offspring are frail and don't survive to reproductive maturity. The next, again, is reduced hybrid fertility. So this means that we can have two separate species reproduce, they clear all the pre-zygotic barriers, and they actually clear reduced hybrid viability. They produce a viable offspring. And the example we're given here is where a male donkey is able to reproduce with a female horse. And when you have that exact connection of male donkey, female horse, you get a mule produced. If you actually do the flip and you have a female donkey reproducing with a male horse, it's not a mule. It's actually called a hinny, Hinny. It's a different thing than a mule altogether, but it still is viable. It can survive to adulthood, but the gametes aren't viable. And so the mule is actually sterile. It does not produce viable gametes. So therefore, you can't take a mule and reproduce it, say, with another mule to create the second generation of hybrids. So that's reduced hybrid fertility. Finally, reduced hybrid breakdown. That's where we get past that step, where the hybrids are actually able to reproduce and produce the next generation of hybrids. But at that point, the next generation is weak, feeble, or sterile. That's where we call it a reduced hybrid breakdown. So over a couple of generations, the hybrids actually become less viable. And so you lose that continuity of a new species. Okay. Again, going back to the biological species concept that you guys researched for me in your flip grids, there are limitations. And what we come to an understanding is that there's a whole lot more species concepts out there. The biological species concept is not perfect for understanding the differentiation of all species on this planet. And some of those limitations are we can't study fossils to understand or to properly put organisms into their species just based on fossil evidence. And we also understand that there's a lot of fossils that aren't created for life. And so we have a lot of gaps and a lot of misunderstandings via the fossil record if we're looking through the biological species concept lens. Also, biological species concept can apply to asexual reproduction, which is the majority of bacterial and archaeal life. They reproduce by copying the DNA and splitting into two daughter cells. The biological species concept doesn't apply to that because we talk solely within that concept about all the ways that male and female gametes can come together to produce a hybrid. And so that doesn't fit. And finally, there are distinct separate species that actually are able to interbreed and produce viable hybridized offspring. The example is the grizzly bear and the polar bear, which are Ursus arctos and Ursus maritimus. They actually hybridize to produce a growler bear. And the growler bear is also known as, stay with me folks, a polizzle, a polar grizz, a pizzly bear, or a grizzler. And I swear it, folks, I didn't make any of those up, but those are just common terms for the hybrid of a grizzly bear and a polar bear. They have very different habitats. They live in different areas, but when they do cross paths, they are able to reproduce and produce viable hybrids. But as we can see by their names, they are distinct, separate species. So there are some limitations here. A couple others that were given in our book, and that's as far as I'll take it, is the morphological species concept. And this is where it's basically just a superficial look at the organism and see if we can look at similarities of organisms and say, oh, they're all part of the same species because they look the same. They have the same body shape. They have the same structural features. Let's call them tiger. and so forth. But this is often used in quick, easy practice out in nature. But this is a very disadvantageous way to approach it because it's very subjective in terms of how scientists can agree and very often disagree on specific morphological characteristics. As again, there's not a lot of black and white once we get out into nature. There's a lot of gray areas, and that just leads to disagreements among scientists in terms of how to properly break up or separate species. Another species concept is the ecological one, and this defines a species based on its ecological niche. You could have two organisms of the same biological species, but because they occupy different niches, maybe right on a riverbank, and then another is up a little bit higher above some trees. In the ecological definition, ecologists may call those two species separate altogether, whereas genetically speaking, they may completely interbreed. They don't produce hybrids. They're the same biological species. So an advantage to that is the ecological. It can accommodate both asexual and sexual species, so it can give us a broader scope. And so there is no perfect approach. There is no perfect species definition. It really does come down to the type of research that a scientist is doing and how they're communicating with their colleagues and with the people in that industry. As you can see at the very bottom, there's more than 20 other species definitions. I mean, goodness, I would never ask you guys to know all of those, but be aware that it just does depend on how we're studying the organisms that we're studying, and how we are going about defining them may come through just different lenses of species concepts. Last comes in section 24.2 is when we talk about speciation and species forming, or one species diverging to become two. We can put them into two quick camps of allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. Simply enough, allopatric just means, in Greek, it means other homeland. And all that means is some geographic barrier comes in between populations of the same species. And that geographic barrier over generations actually leads to the two different populations continuing to diverge just due to different needs and minimal gene flow, if any, between the two populations. And that leads to what was, as we look to the left here of our bugs, what leads to the left of one species here that got separated by a river that started coming through this area and separated the populations over time, just due to their separation and some slightly different environmental pressures. Down here, a lighter color version became the popular phenotype. The darker colored version became a popular phenotype up here. And again, if we think about this over a handful or multiple generations, they may come down to actually becoming genetically separate species that can't hybridize, going back to that biological species concept. So that leads to divergence of those subpopulations into separate species. And next we have sympatric speciation. Sympatric just means same country or same location that these species form. And this picture is actually giving you a side-by-side of allopatric versus sympatric. On the left, our allopatric example of a river, probably which was once just a little creek that was coming through these trees or cutting through. And over many, many millions of years, potentially, we actually get a small canyon forming here and just complete geographic separation, where we get two potential separate species forming. That's allopatric. With sympatric, for reasons, a variety of different reasons that 24.2 goes into, within this same geographic area, we may get a small population that actually starts to diverge and becomes its own species. And as I put here, this can occur if gene flow, even just in this same area, if gene flow is reduced, where polyploidy comes up with plants often. And polyploidy just means that the chromosome number ends up being different for this lighter green population we see in the middle than it is for the darker green tree population around the outside. That can also come down to sexual selection and habitat differentiation that I'm not going to ask you guys to know much about that. But we're just understanding for now that we can get new species formed in the same geographic area from another. And that does very often come down to plants. Folks, that's really it for chapter 24. I don't need to take us any further or deeper into that. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to handpick a few concepts from chapters 25 and 26 that I'm going to introduce to you guys on Wednesday and have you do a little bit of work on for Friday. And then I do have a quiz lined up for us to take next Monday. Okay. We may get a small start on our next unit on Friday. We'll see how the week shakes out. Um, but that's pretty much everything. I am going to assign you guys a little bit of work, some concept check questions from chapter 24, just to nail down these concepts that I just went over in this lecture. But otherwise, guys, I hope you're doing well. I hope you had a great weekend. I continue to miss you guys, and I love hearing from you guys. However, you're choosing to communicate with me, whether it's Remind or emails or setting up just Google Chats just to talk for a moment, questions about content, I'm happy to help with. Please don't ever hesitate to reach out. I'm always near my phone and my computer. If it's urgent, I'm going to get back to you as soon as I possibly can. If it's not super urgent, I'll probably get back to you in the next hour or two if it's just during normal school day hours. And I hope that's working for you guys. If anything is not working for you, connection wise, communication wise, please, guys, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I want this to work, continue to work as well as it possibly can for you as we just keep plugging forward. We've got this week and next week, and then you've got spring break coming. So that's my chunk that I'm worrying about right now is getting you guys through this week and next week. I think, guys, that's everything on my mind for now. Take care of yourselves. Continue to stay safe. Continue to stay home. We're not past the tough parts, the toughest parts yet, as a local area and as a state and as a country and as a world. So please continue to be responsible. If you're not being as responsible as you should, think about it. Everybody needs to play a part in just continuing to bring the numbers down and take care of our healthcare workers and the people that are on the front lines trying to take care of our family, our friends, and us. Take care, guys. Bye bye.